all Western commentators say that Putin doesn't want peace, which I think is wrong.
Investors are very often affected by propaganda.
Russia's not going to bring a war with NATO onto itself because it would lose that war. Every time a Baltic president appears on television, he says that Russia is intent on recreating the Soviet Union. Now, that's nonsense, but they genuinely believe it. Trump, for all of the disastrous things he's done in the areas of the markets, with regard to Ukraine, has actually been very effective.
The position of the UK. Why do you think the idea of supporting Ukraine came along in the first place?
All through the Cold War, Russia has been seen as the threat. Just a habit of thought. The Russians are up to it again.
Do you think that foreign companies which have left Russia are going to get back?
If you want to be serious in the oil market, you have to be in Russia. I remain confident that we're going to get to peace within the next few weeks or months.
Hello and welcome to Capital Horizons, the podcast where money meets politics. I'm Igor Yelnik. My guest today is Sir Tony Brenton, a former British ambassador to Moscow. Hello, Tony. Thank you very much for joining me.
A pleasure.
What we're going to discuss today is Russia, the country about which you know a lot. I understand that you personally know Putin, at least you met with him. Obviously, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, this is a huge human tragedy because so many people are killed, wounded, so many people are displaced, so many families are broken, so many people have immigrated from Ukraine, and some of them will probably never get back. The important thing is to understand how things are going to develop from here. And in order to understand how things are going to develop from here, I think is to understand why the whole thing has started in the first place. So what do you think are the actual reasons for this conflict?
Well, there's quite a lot of background to it, of course. I would say two things, really. First of all, in my experience of Russia, and I think it's a mistake to address me as a Westerner as having any knowledge of Russia. Nobody pretends. We do our best to understand this deeply mysterious and complicated country, but nobody pretends really to understand what's going on. But I would make a couple of points. Firstly, the Russian relationship with Ukraine, the nearest comparison I can make for British listeners is comparable to the English relationship with Ireland. It goes back a long, long way. It is very historical. There's lots of interaction, lots of movement, lots of shared history. The Russians have throughout viewed the Ukrainians rather as we, the English, have viewed the Irish as being supportive, affectionate colonial subjects, and have only woken up very recently, as we did 50 years ago, to the fact that they are not as popular with Ukrainians as they like to think they were. So there's a big shock there for Russia. And they're still adapting to that in a way. Secondly, however, we, the West, have not helped because with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of argument about, in particular, what was going to be done with NATO. And the expectation at the beginning was we were going to get rid of it. It was going to be, you remember, peace and shared culture and shared civilization from Vladivostok to Vancouver, all the way around. We were all going to be friends. All of the disagreements of the Cold War were going to be over. Sadly, it has not turned out like that. And one of the key reasons why it has not turned out like that is because the West, having reflected a little bit on whether NATO could simply be abolished, decided quite quickly that it couldn't. Russia remained very alien to how the West should work in many ways. And secondly, not only did the West maintain NATO, but set about expanding it. And from the Russian point of view, they saw it as a really quite direct threat to their security. We in the West think of NATO as a friendly, defensive alliance. But all alliances are viewed by their members as defensive and by their non-members as on the whole offensive. And from the Russian point of view, this was seen as a direct security threat to Russia. And that security threat was magnified hugely when the question of Ukraine joining NATO arose. For the reasons I've already given, the close relationships, all of that. And in addition, the shared, I think it's 600-mile border between Ukraine and Russia, the Russians saw this as a big, big threat to
Yeah, I think it's even longer, actually.
Is it? Yes, okay, 800 miles. It's a long, long border anyway. And if you look at the arguments and the documentation and the Russian proposals in the run-up to the war, what was absolutely central to every single one of them was that Ukraine would not join NATO. And at no point did the West acknowledge that Russian demand, and still less make any movement towards acceding to it. And finally, Putin felt that the threat, from his point of view, was so strong that he had to do something about it, which led to the invasion in 2022.
In your opinion, from a strategic point of view, from a geopolitical point of view, why is Ukraine so different from, let's say, Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, which are very close to Russia? Estonia, the Estonian border is less than 100 miles away from St. Petersburg, which is the fourth biggest European city.
Well, I mean, two key differences. Firstly, Ukraine is very, very special in Russian minds in a way that even Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania never were, or even though they were part of the Soviet Union right from the beginning that it was established. But secondly, by the time Russia acquired the self-confidence and the renewed power after the great post-Cold War collapse to actually do something effective externally, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were already on the way into NATO. And there was nothing Russia could do about that. And Russia is not going to bring a direct war with NATO onto itself, because it would lose that war. NATO spends 10 times as much on its defenses as Russia does. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore Russia felt that it could do something effective about stopping Ukraine joining. So with those two factors, in a way, the war has not come as a huge surprise, although I and every other, quote, expert, unquote, were very surprised at the time.
Okay, so you believe that it's not only about the pure geopolitics, but it's about the cultural links which the Russians had towards Ukrainians, and basically they considered, and probably some of them do consider, Ukraine as part of Mother Russia.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Putin himself has written two big papers about the historic links between Ukraine and Russia, and has argued that Ukraine was never a real separate country. Now, he's wrong, and that doesn't justify his invasion, but his view is really quite widely shared, in particular among the Russian elite, among Russian securocrats, with whom I got to know quite a few when I was there. He said, well, Ukraine, they're just like us, really. They love us. Half Ukrainians speak Russian. Why on earth would they go off and join our principal enemy?
And why do you think was Ukraine so eager on joining NATO?
Well, I don't think they were particularly eager initially. I mean, Ukraine, as you know, Ukraine is broadly speaking split between a Russian-leaning eastern half and a Western-leaning western half, with a very powerful nationalist movement centered in the extreme west of Ukraine around Lviv. What pushed Ukraine in the direction that it subsequently moved in was, I mean, they had a useless, corrupt president in the form of Yanukovych, who was very much in the Russians' pockets, and that didn't make Russia any more popular in Ukraine. And Russia had the sort of habit of interfering in Ukrainian internal politics. I was around for the Orange Revolution in 2004, where Yanukovych actually lost the presidency in the course of that. But the Revolution of Dignity, which took place, I think, in 2008, no, it was after that. Anyway, when again there was a rising in Kiev and elsewhere, Yanukovych was forced to run for it again. Left Ukraine, and the Russians were visibly in cahoots with Yanukovych in trying to help him put this down. Left Ukraine feeling threatened by Russia, and therefore Ukraine much more inclined to move in a Western direction, which is what they did, with the consequences that we've now seen.
Okay, that's interesting. But the famous Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which is the founding treaty of NATO, does not provide an automatic protection to a country. It's basically optional on Western governments or on NATO members' governments to intervene or not to intervene. Why would Ukraine be so confident that NATO members will protect it should it become a NATO member?
Well, I mean, there's a wording of the treaty, which actually is Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says that if an attack on one member state is an attack on all member states. And over the history of NATO, the presumption has grown that what that means is, and NATO was all about defending Western Europe against Russia. What this means is, if indeed Russia launches an attack on any NATO member state, then all NATO's member states would deem themselves as being at war with Russia. And it was to get the benefit of that guarantee that Ukraine saw the attractions of gaining access to that guarantee itself. I mean, he's had a previous bad experience, of course, because at the breakup of the Soviet Union, a fair number of nuclear weapons were actually based in Ukraine at the time, of ex-Soviet nuclear weapons. Ukrainians had to be persuaded to give those nuclear weapons up. We didn't want any more nuclear powers in the world than there absolutely had to be. And a thing called the Bucharest Memorandum was signed by Russia, the United States, Ukraine, and indeed the United Kingdom, which assured Ukraine of its territorial integrity, i.e. we 4 countries would protect it if anyone attacked it, in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine duly gave up its nuclear weapons. The benefits of that deal, which was purely a political agreement, did not produce any effective defense of Ukraine against Russia. So naturally, now, the Ukrainians want a much firmer guarantee against future attacks, which is why it was so keen to join NATO.
Where we stand now, we have an American president who wants to finish this war. And obviously, this is quite different to the position of the previous US president. We know the position of Russia. We know the position of Ukraine. So in your opinion, where these negotiations are likely to go from here and how fast?
I'm not sure. I mean, let me just say one thing. I mean, Trump, for all of the disastrous things he's done in lots of other areas, including in the areas of the markets, which are of interest to your watchers, with regard to Ukraine, has actually been very effective in pushing things in a much more constructive direction. The war had been in effect stuck for 2 years. The front line had hardly moved. Both sides were saying, the Russians and the Western supporters of Ukraine, this goes on for as long as it takes. Putin changed the conversation completely by coming in and saying, this is absurd, lots of people are dying, this is costing America, not least, a lot of money, we must bring an end to it. And the conversation now is about finding a way to a peace settlement, which is a huge improvement on where we were. That said, the initial steps towards finding that peace settlement have demonstrated how very hard that's going to be. And there are a number of constraints here. Firstly, while Trump, I think, genuinely wants peace, the Europeans and probably the Ukrainians are much more cautious. They, on the whole, think that they would have come out on top sooner or later, and therefore they're more dubious. Let me put it this way. They're not going to settle for a peace which leaves Ukraine exposed to renewed Russian attack in 2 or 3 years down the line. From the Russian point of view, virtually all Western commentators say that Putin doesn't want peace, which I think is wrong, actually. I think Putin does want peace, and if he can get the right terms, I'm pretty confident that he will do a deal. Now, the question is what the right terms are, and we have some indication of that from the last round of peace negotiations, which took place, of course, back in 2022, right at the beginning of the war, under the auspices of the Turks. And what the Russians were arguing for there was basically, we stop the war in its tracks. The line of contact remains where it is. We can sort out the territorial disagreements later. Ukraine will commit itself not to join NATO, which is, as I've said, is absolutely central to the Russian view of what this war is about. And we will arrive at arrangements with the West and also with Ukraine, which limit the ability of both sides actually to attack the other, to relaunch the war. And therefore, the Russians were demanding some reduction in the size of Ukraine's armed forces, for example, which is unlikely to get. But it was in those sorts of terms that Russia was arguing at the time. There's a load of other stuff about denazification and so on. But at Istanbul, the Russians didn't mention any of that at all, really. So I would guess that Putin is willing to get into a serious peace negotiation on roughly those terms when the West will concede that those terms might begin to look likely. There are considerations of timing as well from Russian point of view. They want Ukraine out of Kursk province, out of Russia proper altogether, and that's not yet quite done. And
Almost.
secondly, it looks just in the last couple of days as if they've launched quite a major offensive on the battlefront, and no doubt they will want to see how that offensive goes before deciding how fast they're willing to move towards peace. And if the offensive goes very well, then they'll obviously want it to run. But the history of the war has been that major offensives have usually bogged down within days or weeks. And so let's see what happens to this offensive and then what happens after that.
Okay, so we're quite clear about the position of the US president. He wants peace, he wants to put an end to it. But how would you characterize the position of the European countries, speaking about European countries as a whole, and also about certain countries like France, Germany, and actually it's quite interesting to see your view about the position of the UK.
Okay, let me just say a couple of words about Trump first. I think Trump genuinely wants peace, and he genuinely doesn't like Zelensky, which is not very helpful from the Ukrainian point of view. And he's genuinely troubled by Putin's slowness to deliver on the various proposals for ceasefire which have been floated his way. And I don't rule out that could move Trump in the direction of imposing tougher sanctions or whatever on Russia as we're pushing them into doing the deal. I think he genuinely wants peace, as I say, and that could be the way things go. And I think the Russians are very conscious of that and absolutely will not want to alienate what for them is one of the aces in their hand, which is Trump's general sympathy to getting the war over on terms which are not utterly destructive for Russia. For Europe, the whole thing has come as a complete shock. And not least here in the UK. We were among the first backers of Zelensky. We supplied lots and lots of weapons early on. We pushed the United States into being more supportive of Ukraine than they were initially inclined to be. We pride ourselves on the strength of the support we've given to Ukraine. To suddenly find ourselves moved from being, this is Churchillian stuff, from being on the side of what we see as being absolute justice and truth in this conflict, we find ourselves having to accommodate a US president who's insisting that we all move towards peace. We are doing that to the extent we can. We are, for example, active, indeed leaders in a set of talks designed to produce a so-called reassurance force to help defend Ukraine when if the war ends, to defend Ukraine against any renewed attack by Russia. And we're being as cooperative as we can. But as I watch British politicians, I don't think their hearts are really in it. They would really far rather press ahead with what they see as being an inevitable Ukrainian victory. In wider Europe, well, Germany is in a slightly odd position because, of course, they're just having a change of chancellor. But the signs are that Scholz, and Germany as a whole, is actually pretty uncomfortable because they had a very close relationship and a very strong economic relationship with Russia before all of this started. And there's still quite a strong movement there. The Alternative for Deutschland, the big, actually now the second biggest opposition party in Germany, still feels a lot of sympathy with Russia. So in Germany, there's a lot of resistance to pushing this thing through to the absolute end. But with Merz coming into the chancellorship, I think this week, anyway, very, very soon, he's much tougher, taken a much tougher line on all of this than Scholz did before him. And we're going to see, for example, Germany supplying Taurus missiles, which they have hitherto refused to supply to Ukraine. We're going to see that happen quite quickly. It won't make a fundamental difference, but it's a sign of a tougher German view. France is very much in the same place as the UK, actually. They're shocked that we've been jolted from talking about victory in Ukraine to talking about making peace. They're helping with the reassurance force. But I suspect that, what I'm saying is that Europe sees quite vital interests wrapped up here, because Ukraine, if Russia emerges able to claim a victory there, a lot of people are saying, and a lot of people believe, I think they're wrong, but a lot of people believe that if Russia comes out of this saying, yep, we launched the war, we won it, who's next? When do we
Who is
go for
next?
Estonia or so on? Now, I view that whole view as absurd, because you go for
Why?
Estonia, you go for NATO, and you lose. Nevertheless, a lot of people believe it. A lot of people in Europe, in the UK in particular, believe very firmly. When I talk to people about this, they say, yeah, but if Ukraine is seen to lose the war, then who's next? So there's a lot of doubt and hesitation about going ahead for the peace settlement which Trump is working for at the moment.
All right. So, getting back to the position of the UK, why do you think the idea of supporting Ukraine came along in the first place?
That's a very good and interesting question. And to answer it, you have to look back at our history, and we pride ourselves over the last few hundred years of European history of being ready to intervene on a continent full of benighted foreigners when it looks as if very bad things are going to happen. So we fought and helped defeat Napoleon. We fought actually alone in 1941 and helped defeat Hitler. And people, the British commentariat, the British public opinion, British politicians view the situation with regard to Ukraine as having lots of parallels with those situations then. So as I said, it's a Churchillian instinct here, which led us very early into backing Ukraine and led us into pride in the positions we've taken.
Well, there are some differences in 1941, or actually in 1939, when Britain and France declared a war on Germany after Germany invaded Poland. It could be seen as France and the UK could actually be next. It's very difficult for me to see how, I mean, under which circumstances can Russia, let's say, invade the United Kingdom. It has never happened historically, and I can't see how it can happen in the future.
Yeah, no, you are right, of course, that there are differences. But that Churchillian instinct, I would say, is quite central. I mean, we've been in confrontation with Russia since the end of the Second World War. All through the Cold War, Russia has been seen as the threat. And just a habit of thought, the Russians are up to it again. I don't offer any more rational explanation than that.
Okay. Don't you think that the position of France is to a certain degree because of their traditional opposition to the US?
No, I don't think that's so. I mean, when the invasion happened, and actually the whole thing started in 2014 when Europe was united with the United States in imposing a bunch of not very effective sanctions on Russia at the time. And the view has been, let me put it another way. We in the West, particularly sort of big European powers, see ourselves as the owners of the international order, the liberal international order under which the world disagreements are settled by conferences and treaties and multilateral institutions. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine was seen as a major, major, major breach of the understandings which underlie the international order. So we were able to say of it, okay, they're not attacking us directly, but they are undermining the national order which maintains peace and security throughout our continent and to some extent throughout the world. So, and the French love that sort of argumentation, and so do we to an extent. So that's a set of combinations. But I do not see French doubts about the United States as having anything very much to do with this, because when we went in arm in arm with Joe Biden and with the United States. We were very close. We were consulting, all of us, French, British, German, American, on how we approach what was a very tricky war, because we're not direct participants. Of course, we're supporting Ukraine, and everybody was very conscious, some more than others, that Russia is a nuclear power. And if you get too deep into this, you're heading towards a real danger of nuclear escalation. So it is quite careful how we have approached it, backing Ukraine to the hilt, but not getting into a direct fight, has been really quite carefully judged and judged communally among the big powers who've been doing it.
Okay, if we look at it from the geopolitical perspective and we look at a bigger picture, I remember in 2021, less than a year before the big war started, some commentators and analysts suggested that the US needs some kind of detente with Russia, because if it doesn't happen, then Russia will be pushed towards China. And now we're seeing this friendship without limits, as a friendship could be with limits. But nevertheless, we're seeing this strong and ever strengthening union between Russia and China. And it's certainly not helpful for the US or for Europe.
Yeah, and everybody's been very conscious of the effect this has had on Russian-Chinese relations, and it has pushed them much closer together. I don't think at the time that was very high in people's minds. The invasion was a shock, major breach of international law and all of that, major threat to security as it was seen in the West. You get on and do what is necessary to do. You're already in a situation, because relations between Putin's Russia and the West have been sliding steadily downhill, more or less ever since Putin took power. There was, and as a consequence, or as a linked factor, Russia has grown closer and closer to China over the same period of time. I don't think anybody said, well, we're pushing Russia into the arms of China. To the extent they asked themselves the question, the answer was, well, they're already there. My personal view is that actually they're much more there now than they were before all this started. But that wasn't central to European calculations or US calculations when the whole thing got going.
As a result of this war, NATO added two new members, which are Sweden and Finland. Do you think that there was actually any threat to Finland or Sweden created by Russia, by Putin, whoever?
No, I don't think there was, but I can see perfectly clearly why the Finns, the Swedes, the Balts all saw what Putin has done in Ukraine as constituting an extra factor requiring them to be much more cautious about how they relate to Russia and what Russia is allowed to get away with. As I said, I think the idea that Russia is going to move on and attack Lithuania or whoever is nonsense. But every time a Baltic president appears on television, he says that Russia is intent on recreating the Soviet Union. Now, that's nonsense. You know it's nonsense. I know it's nonsense. But they genuinely believe it in places like the Baltics and around the Baltic Sea. The atmosphere up there is Russia's big. It's look what it's done. What could it do if it's not stopped? Of course, we need to hang together in our defence. And the effect of that Finland has a very special, difficult relationship with Russia, of course. Sweden is in a way more interesting, because Sweden liked to think of itself as being genuinely neutral in its heart between the two sides in the Cold War. Whereas Finland was never neutral in its heart. It wanted to be part of the West, but was blocked from doing that by the role it played in the Second World War. And the Swedes have concluded, okay, neutrality in your heart is a nice moral place to be, but much better to be safe, and that means being a member of NATO.
You know, when I think about it, and I worked in Sweden for a number of years. It's a beautiful country, but it's geographically so far from Russia. It's so inconvenient for Russia to attack it, even if Russia wanted to. From a military perspective, it's just next to impossible. Russia would need to get Finland first, and only then to approach Sweden. And even then, it will be difficult. And another thing is that people do not quite appreciate how big Sweden is. It's a huge country. Its territory is bigger than the territory of Germany. I understand that they have committed to spend a certain amount of money, a large amount of money, on their military, and this is the money which could be more usefully spent elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, you obviously know Sweden much better than I do. I've visited it from time to time. And I got, as I spoke to Swedes, I got the impression of a certain moral superiority over the two sides in the Cold War, and conducting this pointless confrontation, which was obviously going nowhere. And immense pleasure, of course, when the Cold War ended, and a sudden awareness that while the bear out there on the prowl could be a mortal threat to Sweden. I mean, if you think back to part of Sweden's founding history, a key moment was when Peter the Great defeated Charles XII back at Poltava,
Yeah.
300 years ago.
Which is Ukraine, by the way. All right. So getting now back to the financial markets. So we know that a lot of people lost a lot of money due to sanctions. And this happened to both Russian investors who invested their money in the West. It also happened to Western investors who used to own some Russian assets, Russian stocks, Russian bonds. And all of a sudden, the market disappeared overnight and the assets became frozen. And more recently, I have seen people buying Ukrainian assets, buying Russian assets or their proxies if they can't buy Russian assets directly. We also saw market reaction to Trump's election. The markets, the Russian and Ukrainian markets became very optimistic about it. The Russian stock market grew quite significantly. We also saw market reactions to a phone call between Trump and Putin.
Yeah.
Do you think that the market has discounted the future negotiations already? Basically, that the peace dividend is already in prices, or is there some uncertainty which is still in prices?
I think there was probably, I mean, I haven't followed the markets that closely. I do politics rather than economics. But I think that the initial reaction to Trump saying, we're going to have peace in a day, was an overreaction. Actually, this was obviously going to be quite a complicated, difficult process. And we've moved from, I was very confident and remain substantially confident that we're going to get to peace within the next few weeks or months. I don't see why anyone should actually, it has an interest in blocking it. But it's going to be hard because the details are very complex. Everybody hates everybody else, which doesn't help at all. And working our way through that is time. Anyway, the market's overreacted to Trump's initial move and are now beginning to back away, is what I'm reading. The striking fact with regard to Russian assets is that the Russian economy has held together through all of this, through the last 3 years, through the most powerful set of sanctions ever imposed on any country anywhere. And the Russian economy, it's got an inflation problem. It's got an excessive demand problem at the moment because all the demand is going into producing weapons. But what it is not doing is showing any sign at all of imminent collapse or of bringing Putin down, as we all confidently predicted well, I didn't, but there's lots of people confidently predicted right at the beginning. And I think that if we do get stuck, then the Russian economy has the capacity certainly to keep this thing going for another year or two.
Do you think that that foreign companies which have left Russia are going to get back to the country quickly?
Well, there are two questions there. First of all, will they want to? And I guess some will. I mean, John Brown, who's chairman of BP for quite a long time, who I saw quite a lot of in Russia, there was at a time, ancient history, when the UK was the largest external investor in Russia because of all the oil and gas investments we put in, said, if you want to be serious in the oil market, you have to be in Russia. Now, BP at the moment are out, having been forced out by Putin's regime a couple of years ago. But that sort of truth about what Russia has to offer, not only in terms of hydrocarbons, but in terms of all these rare earths and so on, which everybody's so excited about now, Russia has a lot to offer. And no doubt there will be Western interest in getting in there when they can. The question, however, is how quickly sanctions are going to be lifted. And it is not in the least bit clear to me. I mean, part of the eventual deal will have to be some sort of movement towards sanctions lift. But my guess is that the West, the United States, will hang on to as much as it can of the existing pattern of sanctions as a way of being able to tighten the squeeze on Russia should Russia look as if it's backing away from the terms of whatever peace deal is reached. So there's quite a lot of complexity there. This is going to be a matter, I would guess, of years before the Russian market, for the things which Western companies are genuinely interested in, is going to reopen. And in the meantime, the Russians have increasingly have Chinese, Iranian, other alternatives coming in to invest and to mine and to drill.
All right. Tony, thank you very much for this. This has been very, very interesting. And I especially like your optimism that the combat operations are going to end within weeks or months at worst. And thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This has been Capital Horizons.
So if you would like to see or learn more about Capital Horizons, please subscribe below.
From Michael and I, see you next time.